5. January 2nd, 2023. Unlike yesterday, the morning sky was gloomy and dark, though only visible through the strip of outer aperture, of course. Our day's activities started with a bit of inventory housekeeping. After we ate breakfast at the inn's restaurant, we turned to the fourth floor suite and materialized the items earned over the previous day onto the table. The majority of the items were materials of uncertain use dropped by Miraclies, like spider monkey pelts and fluffy tails. But the real problem was what late Cylon had dropped. The gold and jewels had been picked up by Miraclies snatchers before we retrieved them, so they were mixed among our cache now, but we weren't really sure if it was right to use or sell off the equipable items he'd drop. "I wonder if Cylon had any family," Asuna murmured, lifting up a gaudy golden pendant. I shook my head. "No, I don't recall there being a wife or children in that mansion of his." "I see. But the bigger question is, does this mean Cylon's just gone from Aincrad forever? Wouldn't that mean nobody else can start the Curse of Statuen quest?" Again, I shook my head. "No, I doubt it'll come to that. My guess is that when he showed up at the hideout in Cerebus, there were already a different Cylon back at the mansion in Statuen. The one that Morche killed was just our Cylon. I bet that it won't have any effect on other players who are going to start the quest after us." Asuna pressed her fingers on her left temple and groaned. I just can't wrap my head around that idea. The instant map are hard enough, but having the same person in multiple places at once is just... "I know how you feel," I said with a laugh. I poured the pitcher of lemonade-ish juice into 2 glasses and gave one to her. I took a sip out of the sugary liquid and continued. "During the L4 quest on the 3rd floor, I'm pretty sure I mentioned how in order to get the anneal blade on the 1st floor, you would have to do a quest to gather medicinal ingredients from the forest for a sick girl. When she drinks the finished potion, she gets better, but only while you're in their cabin. Once another player enters the space, the quest starts again. They'll just see a sickly, suffering girl again. It's unavoidable, you see. People would be losing their minds if only single earliest party could ever fulfill a certain quest. Still, there's just something jarring about it." "Yeah, I know." Asuna took a sip of her juice, too. She puckered her lips, then sighed. "I feel like Cylon was in pain, too, deep down. He was Pythagoras' first apprentice, but his master says he couldn't inherit the title, so he got mad and killed him, but then had to bear that secret for an entire decade, right? Plus, someone made off with the golden cube that had his bloody handprint on it, so he knew at least one person was aware of the truth. I have to believe that he was on edge for all 10 of those years." She was conjecturing as though Cylon was a real person. As an NPC, I doubted he would feel any guilt at all because he wasn't programmed to. But thinking about it, unlike in the beta, the current version of Aincrad featured multiple NPCs that had so much intelligence and emotion, they were almost indistinguishable from people. Kismal, Viscount Yoflis, and perhaps Cylon too. Asuna leaned back against the sofa, exhaled, then continued. "I thought that maybe at the end of the quest, Cylon would repent for his crimes and accept his punishment. And perhaps even find forgiveness? But so much for that. Hey, Kirito. If we get back to Statuen and we actually meet another Cylon in the mansion there, the quest won't actually continue where we left off, right?" "No, I don't think it will. We didn't actually finish that crucial event. For one thing, I bet the quest log is still stuck partway through that." I had my inventory window open already, so I switched it to the quest tab and tapped the Curse of Statuen entry to make it the active quest. The final line of the quest read, let's see, Silent, Lord of Statchen, has been killed by bandits. You must find the proper place to use the 2 remaining keys? We stared at each other in silence. Then we both looked down at the table. Among the various articles were 2 keys, one made of gold and one of iron. What? Hang on. Was Silent getting killed part of this quest? Asuna asked, but I shook my head several times. No, that's not possible. Morche and his buddy weren't NPCs. They were other players. It says that they're bandits. But it's not like the SAO system was controlling them and making them do that. Then why does the quest log say that? The only thing I can think of is that they considered the possibility that Silent might be killed by another player when the event goes in between towns and prepared the message, maybe. Really? She said, giving me a look in disbelief. If they were going to go through that much trouble, couldn't they just make Silent super tough that nobody could kill him? Well, that's true, but then you'd have to wonder why someone wasn't a fighter would be so strong, right? That's the kind of thing that SAO is really picky about. True. I mean, they go to the lengths of printing an entire contents of all the books in the world, even if we can't read them, Asuna admitted. She put her glass of lemonade on the table and picked up the gold and iron keys. This golden key is the one we found at the hideout, right? So where do we use this iron key? Don't know. The golden key goes to the dungeon underneath the Lord's mansion, but I've never actually seen the iron one before. Dungeon? Is that where you find the golden cube? I wasn't sure if I should answer that question or not, but then I decided that since we'd already completely branched off the storyline I was familiar with, it couldn't hurt after all. Yeah, I admitted. The one who took the cube from the site of Pythagoras' murder and hid it beneath the mansion was the former maid we talked to first. Her name was Theano, I think. She was actually a puzzle genius herself, and Pythagoras wanted to make her his heir to the title. Oh, really? But Theano saw Silent murder Pythagoras, right? Why did she hide the murder weapon rather than accusing him as a witness? See, the thing is, Silent and Theano were lovers. Asuna murmured as she took this in and gazing at the keys in her hands. 10 years ago, Silent would be in his late 30s, and Theano would have been around 25, I think. So maybe she didn't feel like accusing her lover of murder. Her conscience didn't allow her to stand by and do nothing. That's about how it went, I think. Theano locked the golden cube beneath the Lord's mansion, then placed the key to it in the hideout in Suribus. She wanted Silent to admit to his sin and atone for it. What do you mean? The dungeon under the mansion is a string of super hard puzzles, and you can't even get to the last part without a hint from one of the books in the study of the hideout. For 10 years, Theano waited for Silent to admit to his crime and seek her help. She was going to tell him the location of the second home if he did, in order to get back the golden cube. Silent would need to study the books in the hideout as hard as he could and solve the dungeon puzzle. And in fact, the hardest tests that's meant to determine if you got what it takes to inherit the title of the Puzzle King and the Lord of the Mansion. But Silent didn't attempt the test himself. He just kept hiring people to do it. And paralyzing and abducting the people he hired to boot, I noted. Asuna let out a long breath. If Morche hadn't interfered, what would have happened to us? Silent was going to lock us in the mansion dungeon to make us retrieve the cube for him, but Theano found out, and she would have helped us in the back streets of Statchen, and from that point on, we'd work with her on the quest, in the main route. Maybe we should ask Theano about what to do with this key then, Asuna suggested, holding up the iron one. I tentatively agreed. That would be the orthodox idea. We could also ignore Theano and use the golden key to go into the dungeon and get the cube on our own, but I can't predict how the story will proceed in that case. Well, no use wasting any time then. Asuna straightened up with the key still in hand, but I grabbed her sleeve and forced her back into a sitting position. Hang on, we still haven't finished the most important investigation. Huh? But the rest of Silent's stuff, right? Wait, you're not going to sell them, are you? No, I'm not. Although I bet this gas mask would go for a pretty good sum. I briefly lifted the rather ugly leather mask Asuna had worn last night when she'd snuck up on the dagger user, then put it back on the table. Then I put all the equipment into the special hotel room item storage, clearing off the table so I can materialize the dark metal throwing pick and much-used dagger. Asuna grimaced when she saw them. Oh, right. You were very fixated on them. That reminds me. Another one of them dropped for me. What? To my disbelief, Asuna opened her window and quickly produced a new pick. Laid side by side, it was clear that in color, texture, and curving hexagonal design, it was identical to the first. Although, this was surprising. I quickly realized that the first pick of the set of 3 had missed me and vanished into the trees when Morche threw it. A Murukai Snatcher must have picked it up, and when Asuna defeated it, the pick would have dropped into her inventory. Oh, nice combo work, Monkey and Asuna. That doesn't sound like a compliment, she muttered, grimacing again. But hang on. She put a finger on her cheek and remarked, all the items we got from the Murukais went straight into our item storage, right? Yeah, I said, wondering where she was going with this, but I found that I had no answer to the next question. Then why did all of Silent's items fall to the ground when Morche killed him? She had a very good point. We'd survived because Silent dropped his Nanus poison jar with breathing range of us. But shouldn't it automatically have gone into Morche's inventory? Well, there are 2 possibilities I can see. Either Morche had barely any space left in his inventory, or the rules for dropping items is different when a player kills another player or an NPC. Morche probably very high level, so I have my doubts about the former. That's true. He's bound to be limited in space because he switches between sword and axe, but even then, I can't imagine he planned to come and attack us with just under the weight limit. So it might be a special set of rules, but there's no way for us to test that out. How did it work in the beta? I feel like it was the same when hunting monsters, but I didn't PK, so I can't tell you for sure. If we run into Argo somewhere, we should ask her, I said, putting on a hold to the topic of item drops and returning to the black pick on the table. We'd gotten 2 of the 3 poison picks, but the real issue was where they came from. I prayed that there would be a hint to the answer in the item's properties and tapped one of them. Asuna leaned closer to read the information. It's called a spine of Shamergor, I think? She hedged. What does that mean? I asked. I'd been feeling like I was using my partner as a walking English-Japanese dictionary, but Asuna didn't seem to be annoyed. Spine is probably like thorn in this case. I'd assume Shamergor is a given name, but I've never heard of it in real world or in Aincrad. I continued reading. The attack and durability ratings were a bit higher than what you could buy at a store, but nothing shocking. The real issue was the special effect below that. Paralysis 3. When this wicked spine strikes, it confers a level 2 paralyzing poison effect. The poison will wear away after 3 uses. Wow, level 2? We haven't even gotten to level 1 paralyzing poison yet. That means a level 1 cure potion from an item store probably won't even work on this. Then what can you do? Either level up mixing skills so you can craft level 2 cure pots, or use a purifying crystal. But Asana's brow nodded. How much proficiency do you need to craft level 2 potions? About 100, I think. That reaction was so perfectly in line with what I would say that I couldn't help but side-eye her. Asana recognized what she'd done and turned a bit red, stammering, and we're not getting any crystal items at this stage, so at the moment, there's no way for us to counteract the paralysis for this pick. Well, the primary way to undo damaging or paralyzing poison was by using potions or crystals. But that wasn't the entirety of it. Among the seemingly unlimited types of food and drinks of this world were some with debuff curing effects, and there was a good variety of material items that provided curative and healing benefits when used on their own. Then there were armor and accessories that boosted poison resistance, and my mind was completely off on this tangent when Asana sucked in a sharp breath. She'd been reading the flavor text at the bottom of the properties window. Oh, what is it? The sunken elf General Nultza faced the dread dragon Schmargor and cut off every last one of its spines, which dripped with deadly poison, she recited as I followed the text. Apparently Schmargor was a dragon with poisonous spines, but that wasn't the crazy part. The sunken elf was clearly referring to the fallen elves, and the individual named General Nultza was someone Asana and I had witnessed in person. Hang on, you mean this pick is a spine that General Nultza chopped off a dragon? That's what it says here. But why? I had to pause there to get down to the rest of my lemonade. Why does Morche have something like that? You don't think he actually defeated General Nultza, do you? Asana wondered. I thought it over and shook my head. No, I can't believe that. You saw General Nultza's cursor, didn't you? Yeah. Her cheeks went paler than usual. We had witnessed General Nultza in the fallen elf base hidden deep in the submerged dungeon on the 4th floor. I was level 16 at the time, and his cursor had looked pure black to me. I wasn't taken by even an instant desire to leap out of my hiding spot and challenge him to a fight. Even now, 10 days later and level 19, I was certain that if I'd done so, both I and Asana would have been dead in less than a minute. The fallen elf had been surrounded by an aura of cold as ice, and even an expert player battlers like Morche and the dagger user wouldn't stand a chance against him. In other words, if they were tough enough to beat Nultza, they could have easily killed us both without needing to take advantage of that paralysis event. If anything, they'd either have to sneak into the fallen elf hideout and steal them, or they got a very rare drop from one of the lower fallen elves. The kind we were fighting, I think. I myself wasn't certain about this at all. I decided to tap the dagger next to the picks. When I read the properties that appeared, my voice caught in my throat. It was called the Dirk of Agony. Its special bonuses included better poison and frost resistance, and a low chance of causing bleeding damage to any target. The flavor text described it as a dagger given as a prize from the fallen elf commander. A fallen elf prize? I muttered. Asana pushed my head out of the way with her own to read the text, and she was similarly shocked. Does this mean it was a quest reward? I didn't have an immediate answer for her question. The item description didn't suggest any other interpretation, but if it was true, it would mean the dagger user received a quest from the fallen elf commander, finished it, and got this dagger as a reward. And if that was the case, then Morche's poison picks weren't stolen from a fallen elf either, but they were likely given to him. It was one thing if it was a quest that could only be performed once, but in the off chance that it was a reward for repeatable vanquishing or gathering quests, that would mean the paralyzing picks we'd worked so hard to steal were in practically limitless supply. Hey, Asana, I said, right as the exact same instant that she said, "Say, Kirito," we used our eyes to motion to the other to start, until Asuna, who had slightly less patience than I was, finally gave in and continued. "Well, I'm curious about the statue quest, but for now I think it's smarter to investigate these pics a little more." I was just about to say the same thing, I said, which brought a bit of a smile to her lips before they tightened up again. If they can keep getting these weapons, as many as they want, that's major trouble. They might not only go after us, and we'd have to make sure that every player fighting out there in the wilderness has resistance against paralysis. I completely agree, I said. But like I mentioned before, we have very few options for dealing with a level 2 paralysis poison as it stands. So I think we should ask about that too. Ask whom? Asuna wondered. I gave her a sly grin. A knight who would know something about the fallen elves and poisons. The circular map of the 6th floor of Aincrad was split into 5 equal slices by steep lines of mountains, with a star-shaped lake in the center. Statchen and its neighbor Cerberus were in the northeast slice, and the Labyrinth Tower was in the adjacent southeast area. The Rocky Mountains in between were so tall that they nearly reached the underside of the 7th floor and blocked all passage. Therefore, players needed to go around the floor in counterclockwise fashion. The mountains were about 100 yards wide at their base, and the dungeon that served as the passageway were fairly short, but they were packed with annoying puzzles in each room, with a mid-boss waiting in the exit of each area. The DKB and ALS, the 2 main guilds of the frontier, had switched from Statchen to Cerberus in the very first day of the floor. After half the day of leveling and updating equipment, then a good rest at the puzzle-less inn, they were now planning to tackle the cave in the adjacent northwest area. At least, according to the message I got from Agile, leader of the Bro Squad. At the time of that message, Asuna and I had been eating breakfast at the restaurant and planning to go back to Statchen before noon to finish the multi-party quest, after which we'd head for the northeast area. But because of the weapons of Morche and his friend had dropped, our priorities had changed. We put our stuff away, checked out the Jade and Kingfisher, and headed out for the dungeon at the very south end of the area. Although we left late and encountered a couple monsters along the road, the 2 of us were still faster than a full raid party of several dozen, so we could still see 3 groups milling outside the dungeon entrance in its deep valley by the time we got there. Darn, I was hoping they had cleared out the dungeon already so we could just walk right through it, Asuna grumbled as she waited in the shade of the trees. I considered this and suggested, wouldn't it be the same thing if we wait for them to go in, then sneak after them as they go? There's a huge difference between we rushed but didn't make it in time, and we chose not to rush to make it there. Plus, Agile's group is over there already. Indeed, resting outside the dungeon were 18 members in 3 parties. From blue-clad DKB, another 18 from the green-dressed ALS, and the 4 members of the Bro Squad, who wore varying armor but held exclusively 2-handed weapons. At the end of Agile's message, he'd said, "If you have time, you can help us get through the dungeon." So the thought of complaining about our own problems made me feel guilty. "All right, I guess we should go," I said, straightening up and patting Asuna on the back. We headed into the narrow crevice that led to the dungeon. As we walked past the sheer rock wall and its odd relief carving, I made sure to step as loudly as possible to announce my entrance, and then waved to the Bro Squad, who were the closest to us, huddled around a small campfire. "Yo, hey guys," I greeted. "Good afternoon, Agile, Wolfgang, Lobake, and Nasian," added Asuna. The tough guys greeted us in return, although they only smiled at Asuna. Silently cursing them, I sat down next to Agile. A quick glance down the way showed me that Kabao's ALS and Lin's DKB were watching us with disgruntled expressions. I gave them a 2-finger salute and turned back to the fire. Unlike the real world, you didn't need to know anything to start a fire, but finding high-quality logs for fuel was surprisingly difficult. There were fallen branches all over the wooded areas, but if you wanted to make a good fire, you had to tap them to make sure their item name was dead tree branch. A living tree branch or damp branch would produce lots of smoke and a weak, unstable flame. They sold bundles of good firewood at the general store in town, but these were quite heavy and took up space, so you couldn't lug many around. But thanks to the overall high-strength stat of the Bro Squad, they had plenty of carrying capacity, and they were using nice store-bought logs. A metal tripod was set up over the fire, with a kettle hanging from the top, emitting a scent of tea. "How long is this break lasting, Agile?" Asuna asked. The man said it would be about 10 minutes, so I judged I had just enough time and opened my menu to pull out a stash of sweet potatoes. The proper item name was Ichthyoid potato. I'd been keeping since the fourth floor. I tossed 3 into the fire. These food items were around in the beta, too, but they were originally sold off at bargain prices. Probably because it was the half-fish monster who dropped them. Since the fourth floor in the beta was a place of dry, dusty canyons, the presence of fishy creatures made them even creepier. But once people found out that cooking them in a campfire made them tastier than any store-bought sweets, the price shot through the roof, and there was a potato rush as players slaughtered the half-fish for their starchy loot. Information wasn't getting around as quickly in the current form of Einkrad, so I made a mental note to head back down to the fourth floor and stock up soon. The next thing I knew, it had been 5 or 6 minutes, and the sweet smell was issuing from the campfire. Asen and the bros paused in their chit-chat, nostrils twitching, but I let the sweet potatoes sit there on the fire as long as possible. The moment just before they got burnt for good was when they tasted the best, and with perfect timing, I pulled out my sword and jabbed 3 quick times into the fire. Sparks flew with the disturbance, but when I pulled out my sword, there were 3 perfectly cooked sweet potatoes skewed on its end. All 5 teammates held up their hands in silence, so I cut each potato in half and handed them out. The green tea-style liquid that Agile had brewed went very well with the half-fish potato. My hometown in Kawagoe, in Saitama Prefecture, was a well-known area for sweet potatoes, and I'd eaten them all the time since I was a kid. Therefore, I was both picky about the taste and texture as well. As a bit of tired eating them, but even in digital, I would give these sweet potatoes at least 95 out of 100. The potato halves soon vanished into virtual stomachs, and 6 contented sighs escaped in unison. Wolfgang, who was planning to open a steakhouse on the 2nd floor in the future, asked me where to get them. To avoid disillusioning him with the facts, I simply said, "I'll sell them to you for cheap," and finished my tea. The Bro Squad has surely fought some of the half-fish monsters in the 4th floor labyrinth tower, but the Ichthyoid cultivators that dropped the potatoes didn't appear alone. They ran away once they got down to 50% HP, so the only reliable way to beat them was to use major skills right at the right moment. 30 seconds before the end of the break, the campfire was tidied up, and Agile let us into his party. The Bro Squad was just 4 members at the moment, so Asa and I could fit into the maximum of 6. But sooner or later, they'd get more members, and we couldn't assume they'd always be a place for us. It was occurring to me that I need to think about what to do when we inevitably got bumped out of the raid group, when Asuna sidled up next to me with a question out of nowhere. "Hey, Kirito, how does a player with an orange cursor get it back to green again?" Why would she ask that now? I blinked, but soon understood where she was going with it. Morche and his comrades had slipped into the ALS and the DKB by hiding their identities, and they were using various tricks to pit guilds against each other. By the time I saw through their scheme on the 3rd floor, Morche had already left the guild, but my guess was that the dagger user was still in the ALS. But yesterday, he had attacked the NPC assisting Cylon, turning his color cursor orange. so he couldn't enter any town, and it would make it very difficult for him to meet his guildmates. That meant that if there were any player among their ranks who had abruptly vanished last night, or who still among the group with some excuse for why he was orange, that was our man. But only if he hadn't gotten his cursor back to green at some point over the course of the night. To go from orange back to green, you need to complete something called an alignment recovery quest. I don't know exactly how it works, but if your cursor turns orange, you'll occasionally come across an NPC travelers or wanderers in the wilderness, and they'll give you a kind of trial quest, I think. I murmured, not entirely sure of my memory on the matter. Asuna pondered this. Is that something you can do in a night? Apparently, the difficulty and length of the quest changes depending on your crime. Stealing something cheap from an NPC might not need a very long quest, but if you attacked or killed someone, that would be much more serious. And if you commit the same crime again the second time, the quest is harder than the first, and the third time is harder than the second. I seem to recall people saying that if you PK'd about 5 players in the beta, it was essentially impossible to be restored to green again. After all that, I realized I hadn't actually solved Asuna's concern. So I added, I don't know how much it would take to repair the dagger guy's alignment, to be honest. Plus, he attacked the big man, but he didn't kill him. Yes, and another problem is that only half of the ALS is here. I kind of doubt they'd take us seriously if we explained the truth, too. We were interrupted from our hushed conversation by a loud, booming voice from the dungeon entrance. Hey, if you want to tag along, you're welcome. But if you join the raid, you gotta follow our commands. It was a voice I'd never mistake for anyone other than the leader of the ALS, with the Morning Star hair spikes, Kabao. I flashed him an okay sign, and he snorted and turned back to the entrance. Among his 3 parties were some familiar faces, Okutan, the halberd, and Litten, the full-plate girl who had helped us with the last boss fight. They made little motions to catch our attention, and Asa and I bowed back. Clearly, it had been decided that the ALS would take the lead on this dungeon, as the DKBs Lind, Shavada, and Hafner led their parties behind the other guilds without a word of complaint, and the Bro Squad, with 2 extras, brought up the rear in similar fashion. Kabao confirmed that all parties were in order, then boomed, "Let's get through this place and eat lunch at the next town!" The ALS members cheered heartfully, the rest of us at the half volume, and this 42-man group of conquerors headed into the dungeon that split the mountain range. In less than 20 minutes, we were infighting. The dungeon itself was very simple, made up of large rooms and hallways that connected them. We cleared out 10 living statue monsters that appeared in the first chamber without much trouble. The problem arose when we reached the puzzle lock on the door in the back room. It looked like a sliding puzzle. In Japan, those are often called daughter-in-the-box puzzles, with blocks in large, medium, and small sizes that could be slid around. To beat the puzzle, you had to maneuver the large blocks placed at the very top of the puzzle all the way down to the exit at the bottom. But while in the beta test there was 1 large block, 4 vertical blocks, and 1 horizontal block, and 4 smaller blocks, a fairly easy and orthodox example, the puzzle on the door now was much longer, with 8 small blocks in total. Naturally, it was Kabao who confidently made the first attempt. But after 5 minutes and at least 300 moves, he was nowhere near solving it. And Lind, who was getting tired of waiting, suggested he give up and let someone else try. Kabao yelled at him to stay out of it, and eventually the DKB and the ALS had taken sides across the room in glaring contest. Well, this certainly looks familiar, Asuna sighed in exasperation as she leaned against a distant wall. Say, isn't there a simpler way and reliable way to solve that, like the 15 puzzle? Unfortunately, there isn't. I remember that the shortest solution to the original was 81 moves, but this one has 4 extra blocks on it. I don't think I'll be able to step in and do it smoothly. As we spoke, Kabao was busy clattering the metal blocks as he slid them back and forth, but he was merely finding himself back at the same spot he'd been in minutes earlier, and he was getting no closer to the solution. Wait, Kirito, the puzzles in stanchion were some curse from the lord of the town, right? We didn't do that quest, so I don't know the fine details, said Agile, joining our conversation. I looked up at his craggy face and nodded. Someone died at the Lord's Manor, and now the place is cursed. Then why are there puzzles in this dungeon that's a mile away from town? There wasn't a single one in Cerebus. That's a good point. I'd always known the 6th floor was the one with puzzles, so I never thought it further about it. But now that he mentioned it, if the curse didn't even extend to Cerebus, it didn't make much sense that it was afflicting this dungeon farther away. In fact, the puzzles spread to the south area across the lake, so the Labyrinth Tower as well, and I didn't recall anything in the beta that rationalized this. Well, it's all just a setting someone made up, I concluded, lamely, and I was gauging if I should say it aloud when someone's voice interrupted me. Hey, you just reset it to the beginning! Lind bellowed, drawing our attention. Indeed, on a massive sliding puzzle that opened the stone door, the large blocks that was meant to escape from the bottom of the puzzle was back to the starting position at the top. As he'd fiddled with the long vertical block below it, Kabao grunted. When you get stuck, you start over. It's common sense. You just admitted you got stuck, so let someone else have a go. I didn't say that! Yes, you did! Exasperated with their bickering, Asuna commented, Sometimes I get the feeling that they're actually best friends. You might be right about that. Oh, just go over there and solve the puzzle for them already, Kirito. Listen, there's a whole extra row added to what was there before. I can't beat it with the moves I remember. But then I came to the realization. Yes, there was an extra row of blocks, but the difference was just 4 new single-sized blocks. At the bottom, that were the most maneuverable type. So in fact, they could be largely ignored. If all you had to do was get the large blocks down to the spot where it was originally supposed to go, and then slip the 2 small blocks around the sides of it, creating a path to the exit. Asuna was grinning. Well, I guess I'll give it a try. Agile smirked. Leaving the pair behind, I crossed the large chamber and to the locked door. Kabao and Lind both noticed my footsteps and turned to me, ready to object, but I held up my hands to cut them off. Listen, there is no trick to this puzzle other than memorizing the moves. I'll do this one, and if you can remember how I'll do it, then you should be able to do it in a snap if you come across the same thing. The two clamped their mouths shut, then shared a quick glance. Lind nodded, while Kabao turned his back on me. Well, if you say so, then I'm willing to let you try. Then if you'll pardon me... I approached the puzzle that Kabao had just reset and started working on it, relying on memory. I'd said there was no trick to it other than memorization. But in general, the quickest method was to gather the long vertical blocks on either left or the right, then eventually get them to take up the top rows. Thankfully, I managed to inch the largest block downward without getting it stuck, until it was at the original exit position. As I theorized, once the block was there, it only took a few moves to adjust the new blocks out of the way and slide the large block to the bottom spot. Oh! The crowd of players murmured as the massive door sank into the floor, offering us passage into the hall beyond. Let's get moving, Kabao said triumphantly, leading his guildmates through. Part of my showing off was on Asuna's request, but there was another purpose for it too. As the ALS passed, I casually began strolling with them until I could approach the mustachioed dandy in their back row. Hiya, I whispered to Okatan, the captain of the ALS recruitment team. He glanced at me and murmured, Nice work. Thanks. Listen, I hate to ask this out of the blue, I began, prompting a curious look from him. But one of the members of the originally slated to participate in this dungeon, did anyone drop out abruptly just beforehand? But the truth was already expecting to hear a certain name as Okatan answered. The man who gave me the nickname of Beater after beating the first floor boss, the man who tried to have Neza crucified for his part in the weapon upgrading scandal, the man who claimed Asa and I were trying to monopolize the L4 quest line on the 3rd floor, the man who stayed away from the 4th floor but accused me for trying to get the guild flag for myself at the 5th floor, the man with the catchphrase, "I know the truth," the man named Joe. I'd found myself suspicious of him on a few separate occasions, and when he wasn't among the ALS members in this dungeon, my suspicions grew deeper. The only thing that Joe shared in common with the Black Hood number 2 were that the two used daggers and were about the same height. Number 2 had his hood pulled low last night, and also when I spotted him in the catacombs, and Joe always wore a leather mask that hid his face, so neither of them actually showed off his features. Their high-pitched voices were similar too, but masks could change that, so it wasn't a reliable detail. But on the 5th floor, Cabal had said to Joe that the information he'd brought about the guild flag was accurate. That meant that, at very least, Joe had access to beta information, which could have come from Morche, who was a tester. The ALS had a few other dagger users, and much like Morche, there was no guarantee that number 2 wasn't switching his primary weapon while he was working with the ALS. But if Okatan mentioned Joe's name, my suspicions would turn almost to conviction. Well, Okatan started, seemingly without any suspicion, within his eyes darting up to the left, where the list of raid members would be. He shook his head. No, nobody changed their plans. Everyone who signed up yesterday's meeting is present here. Oh, I see, I said, without any visible reaction. On the inside, however, I was taken aback. Morche and his pals must have known, in planning last night's attack, that they would become orange players because of it. Even if their plan was to complete an alignment recovery quest overnight to get back to green, number 2 had lost his special jerk of agony in the saving of Morche. If he hadn't thrown it in to distract me, I would have smashed the smoke bomb away with my sword in the instant before it exploded. Losing the powerful weapon he'd received from the fallen elf would be a major blow to his battle power, and such loss might affect his ability to complete the recovery quest before morning. I had assumed that if number 2 was Joe, he would come up with some excuse for why he suddenly couldn't take part in today's activities. But it turned out that Joe was never scheduled to be here. I needed to get as much information as I could while I had the opportunity. What type of day did you have the meeting exactly? I asked. It was after dinner, so probably around 8:30 in the evening. Okatan said. At last, he seemed to find something suspicious about my questioning. Why would you want to know something like that? Late last night we saw someone who looked like they were in the ALS fighting out in the woods, and they were struggling. I was just concerned, that's all. I knew it was a weak explanation, but in fact, I wasn't lying. I just wasn't going to reveal that his opponents were me and Asuna. Okatan took this at face value, however. In fact, he bowed a bit. I see. Thank you for your concern. I didn't hear anything about any members being in trouble last night, so I don't believe there was a problem. Oh, good, I replied, pondering this. If the meeting was at 8:30, it would have been after 9 when they finished. The attack on us happened after 9. If our second attacker was in fact Joe, he could have been at the meeting. I wanted to know if Joe was there or not, but asking as much would be fishy at this point. And even if Joe wasn't at the meeting, that merely increased my suspicion without giving me any hard evidence. If only I could figure out the reason why Joe wouldn't be taking part in this dungeon run today, when he'd be in every single boss fight thus far. Yo! The next room's up ahead! All members prepare for combat! Cabal shouted from the head of the line. His ALS followers brandished their weapons. I decided there wasn't much point trying to talk further and thanked Okatan before I drifted back. Once the DKB had filed past, I was in the rear again. Asuna zeroed in on me. What were you talking about with Okatan? I was asking if any other members backed out of this at the very last minute. Asuna instantly understood where I'd been going with that. She leaned out closer. And? Sadly, he said there weren't any. Oh, I guess it wasn't going to be that easy to catch him by the tail. Yeah, at this rate, we should keep our wits about us all throughout the day. What do you mean? I leaned over. The truth is that it's not actually too hard to cover up the reason you went orange. He could have said he used an area of attack and accidentally hit an NPC and gotten his guildmates to help him do the alignment recovery quest. The reason he didn't is probably because he considered the possibility that the attack last night wouldn't work. He could trick his guildmates, but if you or I survived and learned that someone in the ALS turned up orange, we can confirm that he was our PKer. And if they're savvy enough to plan that carefully, they could have decided that we'd let our guard down, thinking they won't attack us again the next day, making us easier targets this time. When you put it that way, it seems likely. So, assuming that we'll be watching our backs more carefully from now on, Asuna contemplated, leaning in very close with an angry glare. I'd like to have a correction to your quote just now about if you or I survived. What? Why would you think that if one of us was killed, the other one would run away? Say it again, but correctly. If you and I... Oh, okay. I wasn't planning to abandon Asuna and run away, of course, but I did think it possible that I might need to use myself as a shield to help her get away. And if I dared to suggest it out loud, I'd get more than an angry glare in return. So I agreed with her and started to correct myself when I heard the crude whistle from behind us. Things are getting steamy over here.
They're melting the North Pole!
Taunted Lobaka and Nijan of the Bro Squad. Almost instantaneously, Asuna and I were no longer touching shoulders and leaning our heads in, but keeping a healthy distance. I couldn't help but think, I didn't taunt Shavada and Litton that way because I told myself that being in 9th grade meant I was too old for that. We managed to get through 4 of the large rooms, each of the door puzzles being the same type, increasingly complex arrangements. But we got through them all despite Kabao and Lin's bickering, until the final chamber greeted us with a huge vine plant boss. It rapidly grew pods that hurled explosive peas at us, until Aja and Lobaka charged in with their battle axes and cut it free from the roots at last. I didn't get the last attack bonus, but I was busy dodging the explosives, but according to Agile, all he got for it was a huge bunch of peas. With great sympathy, I suggested that they'd maybe be sweet if boiled. Once out of the dungeon, we'd split off from the rest of the front liners. The ALS and the DKB and Bro Squad headed over to the western horizon, towards the faint silhouette of the next town. But Asuna and I had another destination in mind. The Dark Elf Fortress on the 6th floor was located on this northwest slice of the map. I don't think there's much use in complaining about the map designed in Aincrad at this point, Asuna said, after a few minutes of walking off the path through the wilderness. But when there's only a single line of mountains between us and the first area, it really shouldn't be this different. No arguments from me, I replied. The northeast area that contained Stachin and Cerebus was mostly thick forest, like the 3rd floor, but adjacent to it on the map, the northwest area was burnt red desert, just like a western movie. But there was no verdant plant life on this rolling terrain, just weathered rocks and oddly shaped cactus here and there. When a particularly strong breeze started, it kicked up sand into the whirlwinds that impeded your vision. Hunger and thirst couldn't kill you in Aincrad, but in real world, you'd never set foot in a place like this without more than a few bottles of water. Our destination was near the aperture directly north, after a hike of about 2.5 miles, and there was no path to take, so we had to avoid dried riverbeds and rocky outcroppings along the way, while battling the many monsters that appeared. Furthermore, my partner failed to find the giant scorpions, giant centipedes, and giant camel spiders to be quite icky as the astral monsters, despite the fact that most girls would absolutely hate them. And just as my inventory was getting close to full with unappetizing ingredients items like scorpion tails and camel spider jaws, I finally hit the milestone of level 20. Yahoo! Sure. So what are you taking for your 5th skill?
Mamma mia!
I cried, realizing I was getting a bit carried away just as my partner abruptly hit me with an ice-cold stare. I cleared my throat in embarrassment. Currently, I've got one-handed longswords, martial arts, search, and hiding. So I think I'll either go with throwing knives or sprint. I recommend sprint, she said. It cuts down on the movement time, and it feels just as good to run. Yeah, I like that skill, but I considered that it had been a month since we started working together, and it was probably okay to ask by now, but even still, I felt hesitation. Say, Asuna, you've got rapiers, light metal armor, and tailoring, and sprint. What's the other one? At level 19, Asuna only had 4 slots still, but thanks to the Ultra Megaton rare item that was likely unique among the entire world, the crystal bottle of Allo, she could effectively use a 5th skill. From what I knew, she was using the bottle to switch between tailoring and sprint. So whatever she had on the final slot had been a mystery all this time. Asuna blinked 3 times at the question, and to my surprise, she looked up and away from me, pursing her lips. That only made me more curious, but I never would have predicted her reply. It's a secret. I don't want you to get mad at me. Huh? Get mad? Me? Hang on. I'm not going to get mad. Though, I mean, whatever skill you choose are your own business. The teachers who say they are the ones who get the angriest. Teachers? Well, she might be right about that. But I'm not a teacher. Asuna took the advantage of my silence to jab her finger at me. She continued, We're not talking about me right now. I was asking about what skill you were going to take. Right. Well, I think it'll either be throwing knives or sprint, but I'll hold off on that for now. I see. Well, let's keep moving. She commanded, turning her gaze to the north without chastising my lack of decisiveness. I guess she really didn't want to talk about her 5th skill. For the last few minutes, we'd been walking in the sandy canyons that reminded me of the American state of Utah, based on movies, not my personal experience, of course. The terrain was monotonous, but complex here, and consulting the map didn't let you know much except for the direction you were traveling, but the only way to reach our goal was to get through the natural maze. As long as we knew the proper route, we could run straight there, avoid all the monsters. But even a beater like me, who'd only run the maze once several months ago, didn't have the layout memorized. We just had to keep pressing forward, slaughtering all the scorpions, centipedes, and Mongolian deathworms that crawled out of the cracks of the dusty canyon wall. The light trickling into the canyon was getting darker and thicker by the time we finally came across a sign of civilization. Suddenly, the canyon floor was wider, and many stone pillars lined the way, with some stone blocks placed like a bridge over the fine sand. There was a large gate ahead of us, atop which seemed a multitude of banners with familiar insignia of scimitars and horns. Wow, that is huge. Asuna was tiring from all the constant battle, but even she couldn't hide her reaction to the distant castle. Level-wise, she was still plenty strong for this area, but the combination of these poisonous monsters and the wariness of fresh PK attempts had only amplified the mental toll. We couldn't just stay on guard for these PKers all the time. We had to think of a proactive way to remove the threat they posed, I told myself as we headed over to the stone bridge. Castle Galley up there is the largest of the Dark Elf fortresses. The building itself isn't as posh as Yofel Castle, but they've got a dining hall and a bath. Wait, You mentioned a bath. Asuna didn't jump into the air with a yahoo, but the change in her expression suggested that her energy meter shot from a 30% up to a 70 or so. She picked up her pace, and I hurried to match her, eventually deciding I ought to elaborate. The thing is, the dining hall is great, but there's something about the bath that might be a problem, or might not. What is it? Well, it's actually public. Asuna didn't understand what I meant at first. She repeated, public, a few times, then scowled. Is this like the antonym of instanced? So it's not a space for just us to use? Other players can come in? That's right. Out of all the Dark Elf spots, only the Queen's Castle on the 9th floor and Castle Galley up there are public. I'm guessing they found it difficult to have a whole bunch of these fortress and castles existing in the same space at the same time. Well, Yolful Castle was plenty big too, but I guess I can't complain. So your point is that other players might be entering the dining and bath and stuff, she said. I could practically hear the effervescence of her energy meter decreasing, so I hastened to clarify. In theory, yes, but the only people who can pass through the gate are the ones doing the Elf War questline with the Dark Elf faction, or at least as long as we are. I don't think there's a single other player who qualifies at this point, so go ahead and bathe to your heart's content. I could even stand guard outside, like I did on the 3rd floor. Asuna appeared to grapple with this idea, but abruptly shifted into dead seriousness. And the Dark Elf Castle is definitely not a safe haven, right? I was briefly taken aback, and I glanced up at the gate, which was much closer now. The anti-criminal code that promised absolute protection over a player's HP and life was invisible, but there was something different about the air surrounding the castle when compared to human towns. I looked back at her and nodded. Yeah, I believe so. It's theoretically possible for Morche's gang to get inside and attack us somehow. But like I said, they'll need to get involved with the Dark Elf faction to do that. I don't think they had that much time to work with, and at the very least, it would be impossible for the dagger user infiltrating the ALS. Asuna's eyebrow twitched when I started to say the name, but her reaction didn't go beyond that. Her suggestion involved an unexpected character. Do you think Viscount Euphlus would tell us if he asked? Could he say if Morche and his friends were working for the Dark Elves? I came to a stop without realizing it, crossing my arms. Eventually I shook my head. No, Yolfil Castle is an instance, so Viscount Euphlus should exist in different states for each party working on his quest. According to our Viscount Euphlus, he'd probably say we're the only humans assisting the Dark Elves in their struggle. Once again, I have to say I don't like that system. Asuna opined with a shrug. She turned to the tall castle gate. We'd better be on our guard in the castle then. Come on, let's go. Yeah, I agreed. And my partner and I crossed the last bit of stone bridge to approach the huge gate, which appeared to be carved out of one single giant rock formation. In all previous camps and forts, there had always been guards at the entrance, but there was a special reason that Castle Galley elves almost never ventured outside. Instead, sharp voices issued forth from the bay windows atop the gate.
Be gone! This gate does not open for the likes of humankind.
These warnings were even harsher than the Yofil Castle, but by holding high in the sigil of Lysula's ring that Viscount Euphlus gave me, I caused the guards at the bay's window to turn around and single behind them. A clear, crisp bell began clanging from somewhere within the castle, and the gate slowly opened. It would take nearly a full minute for the gate to open all the way, so once there was a space enough for a person to get through, I prodded Asuna to go on, then followed after her. The instant we crossed the threshold, the gate reversed motion and began to rumble close. Asuna took 3 steps before she stopped and exclaimed, "Oh, Castle Galley was built, more like sculpted, out of a circular basin over 600 feet across. The 3-story castle curved along the inside walls of the basin, but rather than being built of stone or wood, it was carved directly out of the natural rock formation, like some ancient ruin. Surrounding the castle, in a C shape from east to west along the north side, was an open area in tile mosaics, with dark elf guards and servants quietly coming and going. I didn't see any players at the moment. Standing in the center of this open space was one massive hardwood tree. The desert and canyons we'd walked through to get here featured no plants aside from brown cacti, but the branches of this tree burst with vivid green leaves. A natural spring welled up with crystal clear water in its roots, sparkling golden where the sun dripped through the branches. Near the base of the tree was a large hollow knot, and if I squinted, I could see a faint pulse of blue light inside it. When Asuna noticed it, she whispered, "Oh, is that the spirit tree?" "Yeah, there's a spirit tree in the castle here." The spirit trees were like teleporters that the dark elves had and forest elves used to get from floor to floor, much like the gates we players had. But while our teleporter gates could always be found in the biggest towns of any floor, many of the spirit trees were placed far from any elven fort or castle, which I found curious at first. Apparently, the spirit trees had a lifespan and grew anew every 100 years or so, but even the elves didn't know where they would sprout. The spirit tree on the 6th floor, however, was an outlier in its longevity and had been living for centuries, even at the time they built Castle Galley around it. I was explaining all of this background information to Asuna when the door to the west wing of the castle opened loudly. Suddenly, Asuna's face burst into a brilliant smile. "Asuna! Kirito!" Greeting us and rushing over was a female knight wearing black steel armor and dark cloak. With a curved saber on her left hip, her skin was a brilliant brown, and her short, cropped hair was grayish purple. Asuna walked forward and threw her arms wide. The knight leapt into them and circled her hands around the fencer's back. After more than 5 seconds of this embrace, she turned to me with open arms. I'd been going in for a handshake, so I had to stifle my shyness and accept her bear trap. Somewhere in my head was the mysterious statement that it's through heavy metal armor, so it's okay. The knight's embrace lasted another 5 seconds before she let go, stepped back, and clapped my shoulder. It was only 3 days ago that we parted, but it felt like it had been so much longer. I greeted the member of the Pagoda Knights Brigade, Lysula, the beautiful dark elf who was our good friend. "It is indeed. Asuna and Kirito, I'm glad you've come. It must have been difficult to cross this arid land on foot," she said. Asuna beamed. "It was nothing knowing we'd get to see you at the end." "I'm happy to hear you say that. Please, come inside and clean off the dust of your journey, but only after you've paid respects to the liege of the castle. I'm sorry to delay your rest." "No, we're going to enjoy our hospitality here. We must show our appreciation," I said. Kismel looked apologetic, but proceeded to escort us across the open square. Reflecting on it now, between the camp and the 3rd floor, Yofel Castle on the 4th, and Shiyaya Village on the 5th, the Dark Elf NPC had never been openly hostile to us, but they'd been standoffish in general. It seemed that the quest we'd been doing for them had begun to affect their attitude, because, as with the camp we'd visited yesterday, the various guards and servants we passed in the open area gave us polite salutes. It could have just been because we had been elite knights with us, but I returned the gesture all the same. We headed to the left of the spirit tree, to the front of the gate castle. The main body of the castle was a story taller than the wings that jutted about 15 feet or 20 feet above the cliffs that surrounded the basin. I visited the place during the beta, but I merely accepted the main quest and reported back when I was done. I didn't have a strong memory of it. But when I passed through the guarded doors into the main hall, I couldn't help but join Asuna in her admiration. The exterior of the castle galley was carved from a reddish rock, with details designed but uniform texture that didn't convey the same beauty that Yofel Castle did. But on the inside, it had finely laid black ivory tiles, and no hint at all that it was some archaeological ruin. I felt as though the interior was decorated a simpler fashion during the beta, so either Argus designers put hard work into spicing up the place, or the Dark Elves had. We crossed the perfectly clean hall, not a speck of dust to be seen, and ascended the double spiral staircase to the Lord's office on the 3rd floor. The castle master, Count Melangus Gallion, was the extremely rare elf who was large and hardy, with a splendid beard. He did not possess the same elfinanity as Viscount Euphilis, and his dialogue was rather generic, as he welcomed us with a main quest and 3 subquests. When we left his chamber, Kismel joined us in exhaling with relief. I stared at her profile without realizing what I was doing, and she gave me a guilty smile. I am of common birth. Since receiving the duty of recovering the hidden keys, I have more interactions with nobles, but it's not something one gets used to. I'm a commoner too. I get nervous around important people. I don't know about Asuna, though. I had suspicions that Asuna was quite pampered rich girl, despite her propensity for instant violence, and the fencer gave me a jab to the side. Sure enough. Of course I'm an ordinary civilian, and yes, I get nervous. You two get along so well. Well, let me show you to the rooms. Kismel placed a hand on each of our backs and pushed us west, down the windowless hallway. We soon reached a guest chamber on the 3rd floor of the west wing. On the opposite wall from the door was a lattice window, through which the sun setting over the horizon, make that the outer aperture of Einkrad, was a bright red. Oh, such a lovely room, exclaimed Asuna, doing a full turn in the center of it. It's a bit smaller than the guest room at the Yofel Castle, I know. Kismel began, but it's actually the 2nd best in all of Castle Galley. No, it's not cramped at all. I bet you could fit 5 people on the sofa alone. Asuna was showing signs of furniture obsession. She undid her equipment and plopped herself onto a long, wood-framed sofa with an elegant curved design. Kismel grinned, removed her saber, and sat next to her. I got rid of my sword and armor and sank into the armchair across from them. The suite and the Pegasus hoof, where we talked to Lind about the guild flag, had been quite deluxe too. But the castle of the Count was quite naturally a level or 2 above in terms of quality, furnishing, and plushness of cushions. It seemed like a waste that Asa and I were the only players stopping at this castle, and I realized I had something to confirm first. Listen, Kismel. What is it? Asked the knight, who was reaching for a plate of fruit on the coffee table between us. I chose my words carefully. Well, are there any other humans aside from us at the castle galley? Do you know? Suddenly the smile vanished from Asuna's face, but Kismel simply said, No, there aren't. Oh, I see. Sorry for being weird, I said, relaxing. I picked up a star-shaped fruit from the dish. But I have heard of other human swordsmen assisting the people of Lysula, she continued. Perhaps you'll come across them someday. I froze in an awkward position, fruit held just before my open mouth. Nearly 2 months had passed since the start of this game of death, and over 2 weeks since we opened up the 3rd floor, so it wasn't strange at all that there would be other players undertaking the elf war quests at the Dark Elf side. But if that just happened to be Morche and his friends, there was no protection here in Castle Galley against their malice. Morche slaughtered Silent, Lord of Statchen, without a moment of hesitation. So if they wanted to, they could try to do that to the Dark Elves in this castle. And to Kismel, too. In pure fighting power, Kismel was overwhelmingly stronger than them. But there was no overlooking the wicked creativity that motivated motivated PKer. We would need to fulfill our purpose for being at this castle as quickly as we could, I decided. I made eye contact with Asuna, then tossed the fruit in my mouth and opened up my game window. What I pulled up from my item storage, which was the elves called the Mystic Scribing, were the double-sided dagger and the 2 throwing picks, which shared a certain kind of cruelty in their design. As soon as she saw them arranged on the table, Kismel's face tightened. Kirito, what are those? We were attacked by 2 fellow humans last night. They dropped these weapons in the attempt. Kismel was already on her feet. You were attacked? She yelled. Was it just an attempted robbery, or... I think they were just trying to kill us. My word! The dark elf onyx eyes glowed with pale flames, or so it seemed to me. She stood up straight, grabbing the saber she left standing at the table side of the sofa, and shouted, If I were there, I would have lopped their heads from their shoulders. Kirito, Asuna, you must not return to your human towns. You must stay with me. No, we're fine, I assured the furious elf, getting to her to sit back down. I pointed at the weapons on the table again. We managed to drive them off without suffering much any wounds, but they're very persistent. There's no question they're still out to get us. The problem is the weapons they were using, especially these, which are poisoned throwing needles. Can you tell us anything about this, Kismel? I finished, all in a single breath, sliding over the pick. Kismel stood her saber against the sofa and lifted the pick high over her head, so that it caught the light from the window. This isn't steel. It was fashioned from the spike of some living thing, she said. Asuna leaned forward and tapped the other pick. She read the flavor text on the item's properties out loud. Kismel, these human words say, the sunken elf General Nolza faced the dread dragon Schmargor and cut off every last one of its spines, which dripped with deadly poison. Nolza? Schmargor? She repeated, rising again, and initially hurling her hand with the pick away from her. Before she regained her composure and placed the weapon on the table, she gave both of us a look, then began to speak in an officious tone. Schmargor is an evil dragon, spoken in elven legend. Long in the past, when the elves and humans and dwarves still lived on the earth, a wicked little snake snuck past the priestess and climbed the black holy tree to take a bite of a single fruit that grew atop of one of its branches. The snake gained eternal life, but it was cursed, so that everything that entered its mouth turned to poison. Every time it ate, the snake suffered and died, only to come back to life through the fruit's holy power. After several centuries, the snake had evolved into a massive, ugly, poison dragon that attacked towns and villages. But the human hero, Selm, defeated it, and it fled into the land of ice far into the distant north. Kismel's rich voice faded out, prompting both me and Asuna to exhale. Her smooth and lyrical delivery was so pleasant to listen to. We wanted to ask her to tell us more, even though we knew she couldn't. It's kind of a sad story. I doubt the snake wanted to bite the holy tree's fruit out of malice, Asuna said, shaking her head. Kismel nodded deeply. The fruit of the holy tree is said to give eternal life. Its sap provides invulnerable flesh. Many tragic tales revolve around such fruit. There is this story, for example. At the end of the month of Holly, which humankind designates as December, there is a holy sage tasked with the duty of giving gifts to children. One year, he learned that the gift he was to give to a sickly little human girl was actually a piece of the holy tree's fruit. Unable to stifle his curiosity, he opened the present box and found an unbearably gorgeous crystal. The sage desired this crystal, and of all the thousands of children, he only failed to deliver that one girl's gift. Without the protection of that crystal, the girl did not live to see the new year, and she was meant to. So the holy sage went mad, cursed to wander forever through the night that never ends. Do the other stories have similar endings? Asuna asked. Kismel shrugged. Most of them do. The gifts of the holy tree are not to be coveted. And from what I remember, the fallen elves were banished because they tried to harvest the sap of the holy tree, I interjected, which caused Asuna to gasp. Oh, right! The fallen elves were sent to the far north, too. So it would make sense that he encountered Schmargor up there. But wait, does that mean General Nolza has been around since before Einkrad was created? Kismel frowned in silence while we talked, so I cautiously asked her, in fact, how many years ago did Einkrad come into being? Actually, we royal knights do not know the details. As I believe Lord Euphilis told you, only Her Royal Majesty possesses all the legends surrounding the Great Separation and the 6 sacred keys. All we are told is that this floating castle was created long in the past. She paused for a moment there, brushing the clasp of her cloak before continuing. However, I have heard that Her Majesty and the Forest Elf King are very long-lived. So perhaps the man who leads the fallen is equally ancient. Not that he frightens me. That was heartening attitude, but I didn't want Kismel to end up fighting General Nolza. I had no doubt in her skill as a knight, but even remembering the sight of Nolza up close left me short of breath. He could be worse than anything we'd faced so far, including the 5 floor bosses. Though Kismel couldn't have known what I was thinking, she fixed me with a long look from her dark eyes and reached for the table again. This time, she picked up the black dagger that number 2 had dropped, the Dirk of Agony. Unlike the pick, Kismel merely gave this a once-over, then stated, Indeed, this is a fallen weapon. You can tell just by looking? Asuna asked, wide-eyed. The knight indicated the base of the thin blade. Do you see the symbol carved faintly down here? Huh. I yelped. I felt ashamed that I hadn't noticed it when I examined the weapon at the inn in Suribus. But sure enough, just above the hilt, there was a very fine carving that glinted orange in the sunlight. The design was of 2 folding lines that created a pattern of 3 diamonds, but I had no idea what it meant. What is this? Asuna wondered. It apparently represents ice and lightning, Kismel answered. Oh, cooed 2 humans in unison. The Dark Elves had scimitars and horn. The Forest Elves had a shield and longsword. And the Fallen Elves had ice and lightning. In a different game, you'd figure the Fallen were masters of ice and lightning magic. But sadly, well, luckily really, there was no magic in SAO. Kismel put the dagger back on the table and crossed her slender arms over her chest. These are indeed weapons of the Fallen. The same mark that was on the blades who fought on the 3rd and 5th floors. But I seem to recall that the sigils I saw were not simple carvings, but cast silver. Now that you mention it, I think that's right, Asuna agreed, but I couldn't honestly remember. I found it hard to believe that the AI, like Kismel, would be mistaken, so I moved on from there. You're saying that this dagger is cheaper than the weapons on the Fallen that you fought to this point? I would say so, but that is not all of it. I suspect that these are weapons given to collaborators of other races, meaning that those humans, vagabonds who attacked you, did not steal this dagger from a slain Fallen, but they were given them for their assistance. Asuna and I discussed that very possibility based on the flavor text of the Dirk of Agony this morning. I felt like Kismel's statement turned that vague suspicion into an almost verifiable truth. Morche and his buddy had found a quest route that involved collaborating with the fallen elves rather than fighting against them. So we ought to assume there would be a way to regain those highly deadly poisoned picks. If we were going to keep fighting them, we needed a way to counteract level 2 paralyzing poison as soon as possible. I drew in a breath to explain this, but I was beaten to the punch. Do not worry. As I told you earlier, as long as I am at your side, no vagabonds will threaten you, Kismel stated flatly. She patted Asana's knee lightly and stood up. Kismels were not, I started to say, but she only sat back down to motion us to stand with her. Why don't we wash off the dust off your travel first? You must have taken on quite a bit of sand during your trip to this castle. Those words turned Asana's eyes into hearts, or more accurately, into symbols for hot spring. Nobody would be able to stop her now. I quickly stashed the weapon back into my inventory and hurried after the women. When I visited Castle Galley in the beta, I took a tour of the building. A stint in the baths wasn't on the tour, but I did remember the location of the facilities. But Kismel didn't head to the second floor of the east wing, where I remember it. She descended the stairs in the center of the west wing. I found this confusing. Not as much as when we continued descending even past the ground floor. We weren't going to the bath. There was even a basement in the beta? But the knight's pace was utterly confident. The stairs ended on the basement level, turning into a tiled floor hallway lit by oddly colored lamps. As we walked, the chilly air gradually grew warmer and warmer. Eventually, there was a large door on the right-hand wall. It wasn't adorned with a hanging curtain with the word for bath on it like in Japan, but the open doorway was exuding white steam, so it was definitely the right place. In the real world, a place that steamy underground would get as moldy as you could possibly imagine. But we didn't have to worry about microorganisms or viruses in the virtual world. I hoped. When Kismel and Asana passed through the door, I stopped and called out, "Okay, I'll wait for you here." The knight swung around and beckoned to me, looking hurt. "Don't be silly, Kirito. Come with us." I'd feel bad if I forced you two to wear swimsuits, like at Yofel Castle. Plus, on the 1 in a million chance that those vagabonds attack again. Asana looked exquisitely conflicted, trapped between her guilt at being the only one bathing and her desire to bathe properly in the bath. But Kismel had no hesitation whatsoever. "Don't worry about an attack," she said. "This castle can only be entered through the gate to the south, and when it opens, the bells can be heard throughout the whole castle, and you need not worry about the other matter." "Huh? Here, come and see." She grabbed my arm and yanked me through the doorway. It was a kind of rest lounge, decorated all over with attractive leafy plants and tables with rattan chairs on either side of the wall. There were also pitchers and glasses for water. There were no other dark elves here, probably because it was still early. And there were also 2 rattan doors on the far wall that likely led to the bath. There was a circle on the left door and a square to the right. "The bath in this castle is very large, so there are separate entrances for men and women. You will not need your swimsuits here, Kirito and Asana." That makes sense," I said, relieved. In that case, I wasn't opposed to relaxing in a nice, huge bath. I didn't have anything against baths. "We will see you later, then," Kismel grinned. She and Asana vanished through the circle door, waving, so I pushed my way through the square entrance. As I expected, there was a changing room next. It seemed appropriate to the fantasy genre that in addition to wicker baskets for holding clothes, there were also armor hooks. But thanks to my art of misscribing, I could just hit the unequip all button to have my clothes spirited away into storage. After a quick check to make sure no one else was around, I removed the last piece too. Using the provided white towel for the minimal level of defense, I headed through the next door. Tiled hallway turned left, heading toward... Oh. It was a fantastical enough sight to elicit a murmur from me. The space was a massive dome with a radius of probably 30 feet. The gently curved walls and ceilings were clearly carved straight from the bedrock, but that just accentuated the natural hot spring feel. There was niches in the wall at even intervals containing lamps that provided soft light to the chamber. Under the dome was a milky liquid of opal white color, and something that looked like a thick vine hung directly from the middle of the ceiling all the way down to the water. This dome was probably located right beneath the open plaza on the surface, which would mean the vine was a root of the spirit tree. I put the towel in my inventory and set foot on the first step of the bath, allowing the heat to fill me up to the top of my head. This time, it elicited a from my mouth. It was too shallow to get my whole body in, though, so I headed towards the center, parting the lingering steam as I went. Near the root, it was deep as my waist, so I finally dunked down into the water. Later on, I was told that the spirit tree at Castle Galley was constantly sucking up the natural hot spring water through its roots to support its branches and leaves, occasionally becoming so quenched that it dripped like rain to form the pool at its base. The cold pool steadily seeped into the bedrock, and every hour or so it poured into the underground spring like a waterfall. It made a certain kind of sense, and also made no sense at all, but the point was, it saved us from a variety of potential troubles. Asana's class temporarily changed from Fencer to God of Fury, but when she remembered that we weren't in a safe haven, she realized that my actions were meant to do. She cycled through 5 or 6 different facial expressions before she said, "I apologize for doing that," and went back to being human again. I sank down to my shoulders and considered what to do now. The water itself was almost completely opaque, so if you stayed 5 feet apart, you couldn't see the other person's body whatsoever. But I didn't have the willpower to sit back and enjoy my bath, even under those circumstances. It seemed that I should just equip the swimsuit Asa made for me on the 4th floor, but for some reason, she was just soaking in a daze without doing the same, so I felt a bit hesitant to open my window. In the end, I decided that simply finding a way to peel off and get out of here was the best. And I was scooting off to the side when Kismel, who was soaking on the other side of Asana from me, started speaking. "You know about those throwing picks? I think I may know a way to counteract the poison that seeps from them." "What?" That was exactly what I'd been hoping to ask her about. I scooted several inches closer, out of sheer fixation, until a hard stare from Asana held me at bay. "If those throwing picks are indeed fashioned from the spikes of the dragon Shmargor, then the story of the human hero Selm fighting the dragon should be useful to consult. As I recall, Selm gained the assistance of an elven sage and constructed a tool to stop the dragon's poison." "Oh, and how do I create that item?" I asked, leaning forward again. This time, Asana was paying attention to Kismel, so I didn't attract her ire. "Was the sage a dark elf or a forest elf?" Kismel replied to these questions with a short shrug. "I heard the story from my grandmother when I was a child. I'm afraid I don't recall the finer details, but I believe a dark elf storyteller would have a full proper recollection of the stories for Shmargor." "Storyteller? Where can we go to meet such a person?" Please let it be somewhere on a floor we've already cleared out, relatively close to the main town," I prayed. It was answered with a surprising helpfulness. "There is a storyteller in this very castle. but as a good general rule, they are very old and spend most of the day sleeping, so you will need to visit the library around the middle of the day. Nice! I just barely held back from throwing in a sweet as well. It wasn't confirmed yet that we'd be able to craft an antidote. But even the possibility was welcome. As for Asuna, she found interest drawn to something else. She turned to face Kismel, rippling the surface of the bath. I've never seen an elderly elf before. Are they youthful in appearance, too? Our elders rarely venture outside the city. That is why. As for their appearance, well, I find that a difficult question to answer. Oh, of course. I'll just look forward to finding out in person. That's a good idea. I think I'll get out now. What about you two? The knight asked. We looked at each other for a briefest of moment, then agreed that we were done too. One of the nice things about SAO was that wet hair and skin dried very quickly upon leaving the water, so I didn't need a towel off as I headed down the dark hallway to the changing rooms, equipped a black shirt and pants, and entered the lounge. The women weren't back yet, no one else was visiting the place, so I slumped lazily into one of the rattan chairs along the wall and heaved a deep sigh. She threw herself into the rattan chair on my right, a look of bliss on her face, and said, that was good. I handed her a cup of cold water, which she gulped down. Kismel sat in the chair on my left, elegantly folding her long legs, and said, It is indeed quite a splendid bath we have here. It is a shame I will have to move again once my duty on this floor is over. I see. You've got a busy life, Kismel. You've got, the jade and lapis and amber keys stored in a safe location, right? But of course, they are in the treasure repository on the 4th floor of the central hall. Treasure repository, huh? I'd sure like to see that, but I bet it's the type of place where I'll get yelled at. I wondered, selfishly, but Asuna had much more of a practical thought in mind. Kismel, aren't you worried that the forest elves might attack in search of the keys again, like they did at Yofel Castle? This was a good point. Massive gate aside, and thick walls, this place would make a significantly easier target than Yofel Castle, which was surrounded by water on all sides. The forest elves had put so much effort into seizing the keys back, it was hard to imagine them giving up after one defeat. There could be enemy soldiers sneaking up outside the gates even as we sat here. The disquieting thought nearly got me up out of my seat. No, you need not worry about that, Kismel stated. Both Asa and I stared at the side of her face. Something in the faint gloom of her expression told me the source of her certainty. Oh, I see. The area outside this castle? That's right. The wasteland that surrounds us is so desolate and dry that neither the dark elf nor forest elf can last within it for long. Inside the castle we are protected by the blessings of the spirit tree. But if that tree was to die out, we would be forced to abandon this place. When I visited Castle Galley in the beta, the dark elf who gave me this quest, neither Kismel nor Count Gallian, just a nameless commander, told me the same thing. I took it at face value at the time, but now it only brought fresh questions. But then, how will you get the key on this floor back? You can travel through the spirit trees at the castles on the 5th and 7th floor, but the key is still far from this place, isn't it? That's correct, she admitted. There still seemed to be a faint note of mourning on her features. But when she turned to us, she was wearing her usual languid smile. But do not fear. This castle is equipped with all a means to leave in case of a sudden emergency. It will allow us to cross the arid wastes. At that, my partner and I shared a meaningful look. We didn't need to speak aloud to understand each other. Kismel, Asuna said, Kirito and I will retrieve the hidden key on this floor. We might not be as strong as you, but we're much tougher than we used to be." "I do not doubt that," the elf replied, looking hesitant. "But I cannot expect you to do the job for me. The friction with the forest and fallen elves is our problem. And I think of it this way. If you had not saved my life in the forest of wavering mists, I would have been killed by that forest elf. Or we would have fought to our mutual deaths at best. How can I be allowed to stay safe and sound in a castle while allowing you two to do all the dirty, dangerous work?" "Just like this, that's how," I wanted to shout, but the look on the proud knight's face prevented me. Asuna appeared to have more to say on the matter, but I waved her back and said, "All right, then let's go and get the key tomorrow. But don't take unnecessary risks. If any of it seems tough, you must promise to tell us at once." I held out my left pinky finger, which Kismel stared at. "What's wrong with your finger?" "Oh, it's a human custom. When you make a promise, you intertwine your pinkies." "Ah, like this?" Kismel hooked her right pinky around mine and moved her hand up and down. Asuna got up from her chair, saying, "Me too," and held out her right hand to Kismel, who used her free hand to do the same, smiling awkwardly. "It is a strange custom, but it feels fun. I promise not to take unnecessary risks if you promise to prioritize your own safety." "Of course," Asuna and I replied in unison. The knight beamed. After the underground bath, she led us to the dining room on the second floor of the central hall. It was dinner time, and many elves were present. There was even a small stage, upon which 2 elves' fanciful costumes were playing a lute and flute. Some other soldiers were even singing quietly along to the tune. The food itself was noticeably similar to the full-course meal at Yofel Castle, but this was way suited to my taste better, and the stew and tubers and the meat on the bone was good enough that I asked for seconds. After deciding that we'd meet in the morning, we said goodbye to Kismel at the 3rd floor hallway of the west wing. Here, though, the knight's room was next to ours, and returned to our guest chamber. We let out heavy breaths and found ourselves glancing at each other. I felt like I needed to apologize for my scandalous behavior in the bath, but Asuna was sending a silent signal for me not to say anything at all. My game window said it wasn't even 8 o'clock yet, which on a typical day meant I'd head back out for some night activity. But we were tired from dungeon spelunking and crossing the wasteland today, and agreed that we should get some early bedtime. But we failed to realize that we hadn't yet faced the greatest peril of the day. This guest chamber was another suite, where the living room was located in a separate area from the sleeping area. But unlike the place we had stayed the night before, there was only one bedroom door. We looked at each other again, then crossed the living room and opened the door. The bedroom was equally decadent, but there was just one queen-size bed in that center of the room. Last night, I'd slept on the sofa rather than my bed, so I could do the same thing. Except that was because Asuna had fallen asleep first. Knowing how my partner hated to be given special treatment, I suspected, "I'll just sleep on the sofa, okay? You're not gonna get good sleep that way." I would have protested, but she was actually right, and she knew it. While sleeping in SAO, the player's real-life body was in a sleep state as well, but the nerve gear kept faithfully sending virtual bodily signals all the while. If you slept on a fancy bed, you would feel the softness envelop your back. If you slept outdoors on the ground, it would be rough and uncomfortable. Naturally, the latter would provide a shallower sleep, often failing to result in anything more than a surface-level snooze. The sofa in the living room was large enough, and its mattress was nice and thick, but because of the seat cushions were mounded, it wasn't suitable for lying down. When I was soloing on the 1st floor, I camped out all the time, with a blanket at least, so I could sleep on this, but whether Asuna accepted that or not was a different matter. "Listen, I can sleep anywhere. Don't mind me, just take the bed and—" "We are game partners, aren't we?" Asuna interrupted. She was correct, of course. Yeah. So it would be wrong to place all the burden on one of us. Again, she was absolutely correct. Yeah. Then this is the only option. She dragged me by the sleeve into the bedroom and peeled back half of the covers on a large bed. Right in the center of the perfectly pristine white sheets, she drew a line 2 feet long down the middle with her finger. This is the border. I hadn't heard that word since the time we slept in Kismel's tent in the dark elf camp on the 3rd floor, and the surprise brought out a burst of laughter to my lips and a fierce glare from Asuna. All right, I get it. I understand. Capiche. Asuna gave me a scowl back, but she indicated that this was sufficient and put the covers back. While we had landed on the compromise for the bed issue, the circumstances we were a lot different from the tent. Sleeping on the ground meant excusing a lot of potential contact under the general experience of roughing it. But in a proper building, a proper bedroom, and a proper bed, there could be no excuse. The border drawn on the sheets was as fragile and perilous as the line of control in Kashmir. But for being so susceptible to spontaneous action, the fencer exhibited surprising fortitude towards the situation. Well, I'll sleep on this side, she said, taking the half farther away from the window and slipping under the blanket. With her back to me, she opened her window and pressed a button or two, and then closed it. I heard a swishing sound under the covers, which was probably her changing into pajamas. Then she wriggled down deeper until only the back of her head was visible. It seemed that her strategy was to fall asleep as soon as possible, which seemed like the right call to me, so I tapped the wall and turned off the lights in the bedroom and living room. There was a window on the west bedroom wall, and gauzy moonlight trickled through the lace curtains. The day started off with cloudy, but cleared up in the afternoon. Hopefully the weather will be nice tomorrow, I thought, trying to distract myself as I entered the side of the bed opposite Asuna. The bed was about 6 feet across, so as long as I stayed on the very left edge, far from the border, I didn't need to be conscious of my partner's presence, physically speaking. Whatever the mattress was made of, it had just the right mixture of support and softness, and the blanket was light and as warm as a down comforter. I had to admit that Asuna was right. The sofa out there and my heavy-duty camping blanket were a far cry from this kind of comfort. My head sank into a massive pillow and my eyelids closed, and despite my situation, I felt the sleep fairy sneaking up on me. There we go. Fall asleep, and get an extra room tomorrow. Are you still awake, Kirito?
Yup.
The fairy had scampered away. If she had said just checking, what kind of a snappy response should I have? But the follow-up from over the border was not what I was expecting. You know how there's an anti-harassment code? The thing that came up in Romolo's workshop on the 4th floor when you tried to wake me up? Yes. This ominous topic dispelled my sleepiness entirely. Now I had no idea where she was taking this. I was just thinking, you pushed me over when we were in the bath. No, I was keeping you from going orange, but you pushed me over. Yep. So why didn't the anti-harassment code activate? Why didn't it? I didn't have an answer on the tip of my tongue. I had to think about it. Does it not show up if you're in a party together? No, because we were partied up on the 4th floor. Maybe it depends on the time of contact. But no, I don't remember touching you for very long on the 4th floor either. It's not an issue on how you make contact. When you tried to wake me up, you just touched my shoulder, and it went off, but it didn't happen when you pushed me over. Please don't say it like that, I begged. Indeed, it wasn't logical that the code activated just from me touching her shoulder, and yet pressing against her didn't do a thing. Was there any other condition that was different between the workshop and the underground hot spring aside from party configuration and time of contact? I chased away the sleep fairy who was trying to sneak back into my mind, but the soft, fluffy bed was just so soft and fluffy, and if it was any softer and fluffier, it would be so soft and fluffy. Ah! The instant I began tumbling off to the precipice of sleep was the hint I needed. When it happened, you were sleeping. She must have been nodding off, too, because her sleep reply came at a delay. What? The code activated because I was sleeping? You mean it won't go off if you're awake? No, I don't think that's it, but that's the only thing I can think of. After another silence of many seconds, my temporary partner surprised me once more. Pinky. Huh? Hold out your pinky. I wriggled my finger through the blankets, then remembered the invisible line. But the border. One finger's worth trespassing can be overlooked. Hurry up. Okay. I hesitantly stretched my arm, sticking out my pinky near the center line of the bed. After a few moments, what I assumed was Asana's pinky brushed mine and grabbed it. On instinct, I squeezed back. So, what are we doing? Just be quiet. The window for the code isn't popping up, so if we fall asleep like this, and it's showing when we wake up, that would indicate that your theory is correct, to a degree. Ah, I see. The tension drained out of my body. Asana's pinky pressure eased a little bit, and she whispered, well, good night. If the prompt does show up, don't hit the button in your sleep. Yeah, I know. Good night. From that point on, silence fell on the land of the blankets, and the only thing coming over the border was the faint sound of sleeping. I closed my eyes again, but the gentle warmth of that pinky contact prevented my wits from disappearing to all corners. I was curious about the workings of the anti-harassment code, of course, but there were still many things for Asana and me to do on this floor yet. We hadn't finished the cursive statue quest. We had to help advance the progress through the floor. The handling of the guild flag was still up in the air, and tomorrow we'd be helping Kismel with the quest to retrieve the agate key. And the biggest problem of all was the PKers. I told myself on numerous occasions that it was pointless to trying to decipher their way of thinking, but I still couldn't help myself. Why Morche, the dagger user, and the man in the black poncho was trying to make the DKB and ALS fight, especially when it was obvious that it would only harm our chances of beating the game and finding freedom from its electronic prison. No matter their reasons, I would never forgive them for the act of attempting to kill Asana. I would never let their wicked blades anywhere near her again. For an instant, I was seized by a shockingly powerful urge. I didn't want this pinky. I wanted to grab her hand, pull her close, wrap my arms around her. I wanted to make it clear that I was going to keep her safe. But I couldn't do that. Our partnership wasn't going to last forever, and it shouldn't. Until the day she stood at the lead of our best and brightest, standing as a symbol of hope for all the players of the game, I would continue providing her with whatever help I could. As a beta tester, that was my role. I let the tension slowly drain out of my body, exhaled, and tensed my fingers one more time, just to feel that sensation was still there. Good night, I whispered in my mind, and gave myself up to sleep at last. To be continued.